Madam President, I rise today now for the 16th time to call out the dark money scheme to capture and control our Supreme Court. The last time I rose to shine a light on this scheme, I sounded a warning about a case then pending at the Supreme Court called West Virginia versus EPA. I discussed how the court the dark money built was primed to smash through precedent and weaponize fringe legal theories to deliver for the scheme's big donors. I am sorry but not surprised to report that the Supreme Court's Federalist Society 6 did exactly what the polluters asked. Not only did the court deliver for polluters, it delivered big. Before we dive into that, let's recap what we knew going into this case. First, the case never should have made it this far in the first place. A handful of states with fossil fuel-funded attorneys general and an armada of right-wing front groups propped up by dark money from the fossil fuel industry asked the Supreme Court to strike down an EPA rule regulating greenhouse gas emissions from existing coal-fired power plants. The problem was that rule no longer existed. So there wasn't actually an operating EPA rule to challenge, meaning there was no constitutional case or controversy and no reason for a legitimate court to entertain the industry's invitation. But this is the court that dark money built, and it wasn't going to let this constitutional guardrail stand in its way to pleasing the big donors who packed the court. Supreme Court precedent had repeatedly rejected the polluters' arguments outright. The polluters argued that Congress, not the EPA and the so-called administrative state, needed to do the regulating here. But it's a matter of common sense that Congress delegates authorities to the EPA, and it's also well known that polluters want to knock questions away from expert regulators and over to Congress, where their dark money political power, also a creature of the court that dark money built, can be brought to bear to buy delay and obstruction. The power of Congress to legislate broadly and let agency experts fill in the gaps has been upheld for decades against persistent attacks from regulated industries. Well, no more. No matters of law or fact had changed since the last time similar questions were answered by the court. The thing that changed is who is on the court. A majority selected by polluters using hundreds of millions in dark money. Which brings us to the decision itself. There's good news, and there's very, very bad news. The good news is that the court's ruling is actually very narrow as to EPA's authority to regulate greenhouse gases in the power sector. It's limited to deliberate generation shifting. So there's lots left to work with, and EPA needs to pull up its socks and get to work on regulating carbon emissions and other forms of air pollution. So far, in 18 months of the Biden administration, EPA has managed to produce one carbon emissions regulation, and not a very strong one at that. EPA needs to move now as fast as possible. There is not a second to waste. That's the good news. The bad news, however, is grim. The Federalist Society justices loaded up their opinions with polluter talking points and hothouse-grown polluter legal doctrines, paving the way for polluters to block or delay regulations for years to come. Start with the polluter talking points rife throughout Justice Gorsuch's concurrence, which spends 20 pages decrying the dangers of government regulation. He calls regulators a, quote, ruling class of largely unaccountable ministers. This is not even remotely true. If there is an unaccountable ruling class in America right now, it's the court that dark money built and the dark money forces behind it. Compare that to EPA. EPA's leadership is selected by the president, approved by the Senate, and can be fired at will should they deviate from the elected president's priorities. They are all directly accountable. And the White House Office of Management and Budget reviews every EPA regulation to make sure it's consistent with the elected president's priorities. Congress retains complete control over the EPA's funding and has entire committees dedicated to oversight. It's Congress that provided EPA with its instructions through laws like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Acts. Congress also created the Administrative Procedures Act to assure that agencies like EPA carry out their duties fairly, according to the facts, under proper procedure, and under rigorous judicial supervision. And we passed the Congressional Review Act so Congress is able to swiftly undo any rules that it doesn't like. So in actuality, in the real world, there is direct accountability and oversight over EPA by all three branches over the supposedly unaccountable ruling class. By comparison, Justice Gorsuch and his colleagues wield their unaccountable power without even the bare minimum of an enforceable ethics code. This argument by Justice Gorsuch may not be founded in fact, but it has a foundation. The idea that the biggest threat to freedom is an administrative state full of unaccountable bureaucrats is a long-standing talking point of the fossil fuel industry, constantly trotted out by Republican politicians and fossil fuel front groups. Here's just a taste of what I mean. The Heritage Foundation, a key fossil fuel front group, quote, "The administrative state's functionaries are powerful. They are unelected, unknown, and for all practical purposes, often unaccountable." Sound familiar? Here's the minority leader himself, responding to a speech by a Republican senator decrying unelected bureaucrats. The minority leader called this the single biggest problem confronting our country. The single biggest thing holding this country back from reaching its potential. And in the wake of this very decision, he went back to their go-to talking point, unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats. It just is not true. The foundation of Gorsuch's screed is not fact, it's political fossil fuel talking points. And we should not be surprised that those talking points made their way into an opinion by a Supreme Court justice. That is exactly what the court that dark money built was built for. Aside from the talking points are legal doctrines hatched in polluter-funded hothouse doctrine factories, a web of phony think tanks, scheme-friendly scholars, and conservative conferences designed to cultivate and legitimize fringe legal theories, reverse-engineered to produce the results polluters want. One of these is the so-called major questions doctrine, which, guess what, makes its maiden appearance in West Virginia versus EPA. Let's look at how the major questions doctrine traveled from the doctrine factories into a Supreme Court decision. The Trump administration, fully in tow to the fossil fuel industry, took this rare specimen of legal theory and pumped it up into a powerful weapon against the functioning of the federal government. From day one, Trump's top advisor, Steve Bannon, vowed that the Trump administration would carry out the deconstruction of the administrative state. Trump's White House counsel, Don McGahn, the same Don McGahn who oversaw the confirmation of the scheme's hand-picked justices, admitted this, I'm quoting him here, "The judicial selection and the deregulation effort are really the flip side of the same coin." Think about that. In his own words, the Trump White House had a, quote, larger plan to wipe out government regulations using judges. For 4 years, Trump lawyers argued in court for this major questions doctrine, previously unmentioned in any Supreme Court decision. The Trump team urged courts to deploy the doctrine to strike down agency laws, including in this case, West Virginia versus EPA. Now, while the court had never mentioned the doctrine, it had been mentioned. Brett Kavanaugh on the D.C. Circuit did while he was auditioning himself for a seat on the Supreme Court, to catch the eye of the scheme donors and to telegraph to them how eager he was to do their bidding. Kavanaugh wrote a dissent in a case about net neutrality, a case with many of the scheme's dark money front groups, Cato, Competitive Enterprise Institute, Pacific Legal Foundation, present as amici. They were the right audience for Kavanaugh's major questions audition tape, and he aimed to please. And the payday for scheme donors came in West Virginia versus EPA. At least 14 polluter front group amici showed up to push in chorus for their major questions doctrine. The usual suspects, funded by fossil fuel dark money, like Cato, the Koch flagship, Americans for Prosperity, and Competitive Enterprise Institute. Justice Gorsuch's concurrence is rife with citations legitimizing Doctrine Factory scholarship. He cites articles written by the founder and president of the Free State Foundation, a member of the Dark Money State Policy Network, by a member of the Dark Money Federalist Society's Administrative Law Group Executive Committee, and by the former president of the Koch-funded American Enterprise Institute. The scheme is all about boosting corporate power and rolling back government regulation. And it's not just about building a dark money court. It's about front groups by the dozen which operate in coordinated flotillas. It's about faux scholarship, reverse engineered in a parallel universe of faux academia to give polluters power over government. And it's about more than $500 million in dark money spent to set up and run the whole sham enterprise. The attack on regulation began with an effort to revive the so-called non-delegation doctrine, discarded by the Supreme Court almost 100 years ago. Like the major questions doctrine, the non-delegation doctrine allowed courts to strike down agency rules when Congress wasn't explicit enough in delegating power. Polluters loved it. Scheme front groups like the Cato Institute, propped up by the dark money from the fossil fuel billionaire Koch family and from companies like ExxonMobil, sponsored research that argued for reviving the non-delegation doctrine. They organized conferences and seminars, lobbied legislators, and funded law groups designed to spread the idea far and wide. But major questions had one advantage. Years ago, on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, Justice Breyer had used those two words once in passing in a lengthy law review article. They could seize that camouflage. And guess what? Major questions is just non-delegation in disguise. If you don't believe me, let's go back to Justice Gorsuch in a concurrence from another case earlier this year. I quote, "The major questions doctrine is closely related to what is sometimes called the non-delegation doctrine. Indeed, for decades, courts have cited the non-delegation doctrine as a reason to apply the major questions doctrine. Whichever the doctrine, the point is the same." End quote. Indeed. The point is that a court captured by polluter interests will find any way it can to import polluter doctrine cooked up in polluter-funded doctrine factories into the law of the land. And that's just what they just did in West Virginia versus EPA. For the polluters, mission accomplished. The court that dark money built had already wreaked havoc in our law. Even before they got to 6, they had run up 80 5-4 partisan decisions benefiting big Republican donor interests. 80 5-4 partisan decisions benefiting big Republican donor interests. Now, with 6 justices, they have set about destroying precedent left and right, taking away the constitutional right of women to control their own reproductive decisions, blocking efforts to reduce gun violence, and now adopting new theories to empower polluters against public health regulation. The FedSoc 6's hatred for regulation isn't shared much outside the polluter-funded parallel universe. Most Americans appreciate regulations. They appreciate regulations that help make sure food and water are safe, that their air is clean to breathe, that medicines actually work, that markets operate honestly, that investors have real information, that car seats protect you in a car wreck. The American people are right to sense that something is deeply amiss at the United States Supreme Court. A captured court presents an unprecedented challenge to the other branches of government, but we aren't helpless. First is we need to start telling the truth about what is going on. The pattern is unmistakable, and people across the country need to understand this is not right. This is not normal. We can also pass laws like my Disclose Act, which I hope will be coming up for a vote shortly, to shine light on the dark money donors who captured our court in a long scheme. We can require real ethics requirements for Supreme Court justices, just like all other federal judges already have. Remember the ongoing ethics investigations against Judge Kavanaugh? They were dropped, not because they were resolved, not because they ended, not because he was found not culpable. They were dropped against Judge Kavanaugh because he escaped to the Supreme Court, where ethics investigations don't exist. So they had to shut down the ongoing investigations. That's a terrible signal. We can also require justices to report gifts and hospitality, as all other judges do, and all senior government officials do in the executive and legislative branches. There are many ways to push back against the new ruling class of unaccountable ministers occupying the captured court, and to assure the American people that fairness and justice, and not the court's deep-pocketed special interest friends, are what drives court decisions. There is a lot to be done, Madam President, and we need to begin. To be continued. I yield the floor.